I wish he hadn't used the rhetoric that he did, that of the greatest reforms of the post-war era. He's obviously not going to do that well.
You're listening to Asian News Weekly, news commentary and analysis from the Asia-Pacific region. Is Asia's alpha dog China? Shinzo Abe pushes reform in Japan, but at what price? And will democracy ever come to Thailand? These stories and more on the February 20th edition of Asian News Weekly. Hello everyone, thank you so much for tuning in this week. I'm your host, Steve Miller, and I'd like to thank you for listening and downloading to the very first Asian News Weekly podcast of 2015. As we come to the end of the Chinese or Lunar New Year holiday, hundreds of millions of Chinese travelers are returning from visiting family, friends, and even other locations around the globe. In fact, the Chinese New Year, which this year celebrates the start of the wooden sheep or goat, is the single largest travel holiday the nation celebrates. Several countries are actually actively courting Chinese tourists, since when you actually look at the numbers, it's easy to see why. It can be an economic windfall. The Philippines, for example, which did see a drop in Chinese visitors, down from 18,500 to only 7,000 between the months of August and September of last year, was especially looking for a bump, since Manila is home to the oldest Chinatown in the world. But leading up to this Lunar New Year holiday, the archipelago did accuse a Chinese Coast Guard vessel of ramming 3 different fishing boats near the Scarborough Shoal. So I had to ask, is China bullying smaller ASEAN nations in the South China Sea, as some have suggested?
Well, I think one of the things that we're likely to see, and it comes about with this most recent incident with the Philippines, but also over the course of the summer with the oil platform that was placed down in disputed territory with Vietnam.
Mark Kozad, Senior Defense Policy Analyst with the RAND Corporation.
And I think that as the Chinese have placed pressure on these individual countries and tried to keep the situation from becoming internationalized, many of these smaller countries really don't see very broad strategies or really a way that they can stand up to China in many of these disputes in an effective manner. And I think the one thing that they're turning to now is trying to internationalize the situation, which is something that China doesn't want. China wants to keep this in terms of bilateral negotiations. That's been a major goal that it's had in respect to ASEAN. It hasn't wanted a block negotiation. It's wanted to really keep it focused on one country at a time. But I think as countries start seeing that they have fewer and fewer options, particularly the Philippines and Vietnam, they're going to start pressing their claims more actively in the international community. And I think the impact that that could have is that it could make China even more aggressive in attempting to convince those countries that that's not in their best interest to do that, and it's not in the interest of stability.
That's just a small portion of our conversation. You'll be able to hear the complete discussion next Wednesday, February 25th on Asia Now. I asked Mark to comment on President Xi's graph probes, what he sees China doing in the South China Sea, and what could happen with its security forces in regions like Xinjiang. But before we move on, I'd like to hear from you. Do you think China is Asia's top alpha dog? Are they running this show and dictating terms not only to weaker ASEAN members, but to countries like South Korea, Japan, and the United States? Let me know. And coming up later in the podcast, will Thailand ever see democracy? Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe used a snap election to justify his vision of the country. In his first speech since reorganizing the cabinet following that event, Abe announced he wanted to implement a number of reforms. Quote, "A rocky road lies ahead of all these goals. The greatest reform effort since the end of the war," Abe said before continuing, quote, "However, we must undauntedly make progress in carrying out these reforms. End quote. Returning to the podcast is Michael Chuchek, adjunct fellow at the Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies at Temple University, Japan, to shed some light on Abe's plans. Mr. Chuchek, welcome back to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
So in recent weeks, specifically last week, Prime Minister Abe announced that he wishes to carry out a series of reforms, what he's calling the greatest since World War II. And these focus on a number of different areas, including economic and strategic sectors. So I want to begin with this. Japan is now officially out of its recession, even though the economic growth is pretty much flat. Moving forward with Abe's planned reforms, I wanted to get your opinion on what this could mean for Abenomics.
The Abenomics argument is that there are just a basic set of things that Japan, the government of Japan, needs to do to set up the criteria and the requirements for Japan's economy to enter a self-perpetuating spiral of good news, that in where higher wages will make people's buying power greater. Of course, paying people more means that companies have to charge more, which means they have to charge their customers more, which means rising prices. And rising prices will be reflected in a positive inflation rate. There's going to be, the more money you can charge to a customer, the more you can pay your workers. There's supposed to be this some cycle that is supposed to establish itself. And after 2 years, we have positive inflation. And we do have a large increase in the number of people working, but wages haven't gone up. And no one knows, aside from yelling at companies, raise your wages, how to make that happen. And then the second thing is, once people's wages raised, will they spend that money and buy products and therefore create profits for companies that they can then once again pass on to their workers? These last two steps, wages going up and spending going up, are stalled. And they still remain stalled even with the positive numbers that we have had in the last quarter. Yes, Japan's out of its recession, but who knows, it may just collapse back into recession in the spring.
Well, that was one of the things that analysts said, is that you had two previous quarters where you signified a recession. One quarter of, quote, positive growth does not mean that the problem is over. Is there a plan to effectively have businesses carry out these two items?
Well, that's the thing. There is a plan, and it's been engaged, and what it is basically telling them, talking to them, convincing them, putting them into the same room as labor representatives, and having them come to an agreement about wages going up. And that's not just wages going up the usual wage, which is through seniority. Your paycheck gets bigger every year, no matter what the inflation rate is, or whether even your company's making money, but simply because you've been working for the company for a longer period of time. But now they're talking about what's called bea, which is base up. It's a conversion from the English, where everybody in the company will get a 2% raise, is what the goal is. Okay, that's fine. Unfortunately, Japanese citizens have been living off their savings for a long time. And in fact, in the last quarter, national savings was negative. Most economists will say the first thing they're going to do is not spend that extra money. They're going to save it in order to build up the savings that they've run down, at which point Abenomics hits another wall. So even if the very, very unorthodox method of talking and scolding companies into raising wages works, the next step is to get people happy about spending again. And that's really going to be hard, considering they're looking ahead and they're seeing a rising tax rate on consumption. In the year 2017, it was put off, but they know it's coming. And they're probably going to save for a while, then splurge before the tax rise, and then the economy will collapse, just as it did in the earlier parts of 2014.
And that's not good. Let's switch gears for a minute and turn to strategic goals. Prime Minister Abe has said that he wishes for Japan to take a greater security role in the region and possibly take the constitutional amendment of Article 9 to the people for a popular vote, a referendum, if you will. I want to get your opinion. Is there enough political support to actually amend the Constitution or possibly alter the contents of Article 9 or simply just eradicate it?
Not at the present time and not for the foreseeable future. The first thing that the Team Abe has to do is get past the House of Councilors election in 2016. The opposition Democratic Party of Japan 6 years ago won a big victory, and its senators, that's what they're called, are up for re-election in 2016. And the LDP and its partner, the Komeito, really want to make huge inroads on the DPJ's senatorial group, because then they will have in the House of Councilors, the upper house, will be close to a 2/3 majority, if not indeed a 2/3 majority of the seats, at which point they can submit to the House of Representatives, the lower house, an amendment to the Constitution. If it passes, and it will because they've got a 2/3 majority there, it would then go to the House of Councilors, where it has to pass with another 2/3 majority, and then be put in a referendum to the people, where it only has to pass with a 50% majority. The problem is that things aren't going for Abe and his friends as well as they should be after having had a huge monetary stimulus and a huge fiscal boost, which are not replicable. You can't just keep increasing the size of the balance sheet of the Bank of Japan, and you can't keep on increasing the budget deficit and the national debt at the rates which they've been doing for the first 2 years to get to where we are today. And where we are today is 2 quarters of recession followed by 2% growth, which is not spectacular. So looking at 2016, looking ahead, we don't see much hope for him on the economic side, and that's what people really care about. So when you're talking about amending the Constitution, he first has to get the votes in the Diet, the Parliament, and it's kind of iffy.
Even with the public sentiment following the brutal death of the 2 Japanese nationals at the hands of ISIS, is there any support coming for a change, though?
No, there's really nothing there right now, because we had a rise in the cabinet's popularity, and that shows that the people did rally around the prime minister and the cabinet in this very tough situation. And the majority of people feel that the situation was handled relatively well, 60% or less, but more than half. However, the rise that the prime minister got out of being tough and not paying ransom and not in any way showing weakness was a mere 5% of the electorate. He can argue, look, I got a positive reading, but his opponents can say, yeah, but it was only 5%. Both sides are right. 5% is really not much more than the error in any kind of polling.
Right. So essentially it's a good bump in the positive direction, but not enough to make any significant difference.
But of course, the opposite holds true. The people who say that Abe blew it and he goaded on the hostage takers by his speech in Cairo, their argument doesn't hold up either in terms of the public sentiment. You would have to have seen a big collapse, 10, 15 points in his cabinet support ratings. That didn't happen. So both sides can argue that they were right, and it's a little bit of both, really.
My question to you is this, is overall, do you think Abe will be able to carry out these reforms in the coming years before the next election?
I wish he hadn't used the rhetoric that he did, that of the greatest reforms of the post-war era. He's obviously not going to do that well. But if he has some basic, simple things, a few of them, that he wants to get done, and he's started on that with his reforms of the agricultural sector, and just started. It's only the beginnings. No matter if he declares victory at this point, he's deluding himself. But if he sets up a few things that he wants to get done and tones down the rhetoric, calling it the greatest was just, he sets himself up for a fall. If he gets to a small set of things, yeah, he can do them. He's got the votes in the House of Representatives. He's got the majority in the House of Councilors. There's so much he can do if he just can get his party members together and vote for something. He is in a position. Most of the leaders, all of the leaders of the G7, most of the leaders of the G20, and most of the leaders of the OECD countries would pay dearly to have majorities in both houses, and solid ones, to be able to enact whatever legislation he can convince his own allies to agree to. Almost no one in the rest of the world has that power and has that potential. So, gosh, he can get things done. But he has to choose a few of them that are reasonable.
Michael Chuchek is an adjunct fellow at the Institute for Contemporary Asian Studies at Temple University, Japan. Thanks so much for joining me this week.
All right. Thank you very much.
Later on, a look at freedoms in the region. Thailand was riddled by protests in 2014. Clashes between competing red and yellow shirt supporters ultimately prompted then General Prayut Chan-o-cha to step in, first declaring martial law and then instigating a full-blown coup. The general, now prime minister, vowed to implement a wide variety of reforms and restore democracy to the nation. Just when will that take place is, well, anyone's guess. He originally said it would take place in about a year, but that's continuously being pushed back. Not too long ago, Prayut told a Japanese newspaper that the military will return to the barracks once a civilian government is chosen. When asked about the possibility of future coups, Prayut didn't answer directly, but said, quote, "Thailand is different from other countries. If something cannot be solved, the military will solve it," end quote. Which brings up the following: a proposed revision to the Military Court Act that would broadly empower the armed forces to detain civilians without charge for nearly 3 months. It's a measure Human Rights Watch opposes. Before this month concludes, the National Legislative Assembly is expected to consider a draft amendment changing the 1955 statute of the Military Court Act, specifically Article No. 46. Article No. 46 of the amended law would allow local military commanders to detain civilians for up to 84 days without charge or even judicial oversight. Brad Adam, Human Rights Watch Asia Director, says, quote, "Thailand's government is trying to hand the military unchecked authority to detain civilians. Thai lawmakers should reject this military power grab that puts all citizens at risk of prolonged detention without charge," end quote. The junta has already issued orders granting military courts jurisdiction in matters previously governed by civilian courts. Since the coup, the military has arbitrarily detained hundreds of civilians under its martial law powers, trying many in its military courts, a move Human Rights Watch says violates international law. Human Rights Watch even goes on to say that those being held have been denied access to lawyers and family members, and that the junta has disregarded and refused to seriously investigate detainees' allegations of torture and ill treatment. The proposed amendment is just the junta's latest broken promise to return the country to rights-respecting democratic rule, Adams said, adding, enshrining detention without charge and military trials of civilians will perpetuate dictatorship, not democracy, in Thailand. Driving home this point are comments made by several analysts. They say there is no provision for civilian judicial scrutiny. It would enable military officers with the rank of division commander and above the ability to decide what circumstances warrant an individual's detention. In addition to Human Rights Watch, the United Nations and Amnesty International have raised concerns about that amendment. But beyond that, what exactly can be done? Well, nothing. No solutions are being offered. The truth of the matter is that for the time being, Prayut is leading the country, and while there are serious human rights issues warranting criticism, we no longer see the clashes in the streets of Bangkok that took place nearly a year ago. Make no mistake, personal freedoms not only need to be protected in Thailand, but restored. The fact that peaceful demonstrations voicing opposition to the junta are cracked down upon is worrisome. But the former general has the support of the king, and international leaders have met with him, and therefore solidified his position. If Prayut is to be taken at his word that martial law will be revoked and democracy fully restored once all the envisioned political reforms are in place, perhaps time would be better spent in providing support to that endeavor. Granted, it's not likely the junta would accept outside assistance in implementing its reforms. Such a move would likely be seen as a threat to its control, which it appears to covet. However, if it did earnestly accept input from experts to speed the reform process along, and more importantly, implemented those changes, it would go a long way to quell the belief that Thailand is moving backwards rather than forwards. That move would also restore much of the aid pulled after the coup, which would benefit all Thais. It's a nice thought, but it's just that. The question on everyone's mind still remains, will democracy ever return to Thailand? Be sure to let me know what you think in the comments. As for what else is happening in the Asia-Pacific region, well, that's coming up in just a moment with a weekly wrap-up of the news you may have missed. In the past year, we've seen a trend with many governments imprisoning critics. It leaves some to wonder just how free Asia is and what the future holds, specifically that here in 2015. It also is important to note that while the events themselves are reported, and some even gain widespread international attention, they also often fade from the limelight once a new bombing or raid climbs to the top of the news cycle. It's for that reason I'd like to focus on 3 stories that are fairly representative of some of the trends we're currently seeing in Asia. The first one is from Vietnam. After releasing 2 bloggers, Vietnam has sentenced 3 other activists to prison terms of up to 18 months for anti-state activities. A court in the southern Dong Nai province found Pham Minh Vu, Do Nam Tung, and Ly Thi Pyong An guilty of abusing democratic freedoms under a controversial law criticized by activists and human rights groups as too vague and prone to abuse by officials. Vu actually refused to plead guilty and received the longest sentence of the 3, 18 months in jail. Pham admitted to his activities, but claimed that they were not illegal. Pham's lawyer said, quote, "In that instance, when the client does not plead guilty, my line of defense therefore is that there is not enough evidence to convict a defendant." End quote. According to a state-run news website, the 3 were arrested last May after protests against China for placing that oil rig in disputed waters in the South China Sea. If we switch gears to South Korea, this past October, Tetsuya Kato, former Seoul bureau chief for the Japanese Senkai Shimbun, was charged with defaming President Park Geun-hye. As part of his ordeal, South Korea imposed a travel ban during the trial. Kato recently petitioned the courts to have that travel ban lifted, which has actually been reissued 6 times since the start of the case. The court said the travel ban is justified because there is no guarantee Kato would return to South Korea to continue the trial. Since Kato has lived in South Korea for more than 4 years, the court reasoned staying longer shouldn't inflict unbearable damages on him, and actually recommended that his family travel from Japan to Seoul and visit him. To the outside world, the case against Kato appears absurd. While the Japanese journalist did print rumors, which some say amounts to shoddy journalism, the information had been alluded to in Korean publications, and their substance was clearly in the public interest. This isn't the first time President Park's office has filed charges against news organizations, and with the recent appointment of Lee Won-gu as Prime Minister, who is actually heard on tape bullying the media, one has to wonder, will it be the last? And finally, I turn to Malaysia and the conviction of opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim. Yes, sodomy is a crime in Malaysia, and no matter how much we may dislike that, it is a crime. And if you are convicted, you need to do the time. But throughout the entire matter, there have been accusations that the case was politically motivated. The diplomat's Luke Hunt drove that point home recently. He noted that wire service journalists released Anwar's verdict at about 11:11 a.m. He then said that less than 10 minutes later, government boffins had reacted, written more than 100 words, had it approved by the appropriate government departments, and emailed it to hundreds of media people. Hunt noted that putting together that particular release was suspect, almost as if the government knew what was about to transpire. Following the trial, political cartoonist Zulkifli Anwar ul Haq, a political satirist who goes under the name Zunar, was arrested after he posted a tweet criticizing the decision. In addition to that, Khalid Abu Bakar, Malaysia's police chief, ordered an investigation into opposition politicians for sedition. When you think about what else is taking place on the Asian political scene, one has to wonder, will we ever see the idolized freedoms typically characterized by the West? Don't miss our Asia Now podcast. It's released every Wednesday and features stories and interviews from the Asia-Pacific region. This week on Asia Now, a very short interview with Phil Robertson of Human Rights Watch. He compares and contrasts human rights in North and South Korea, as well as how they compare to regional peers. And now for a quick look at what else is taking place in the region. As Alabama in the United States struggles to implement same-sex marriages, the energetic Tokyo district of Shibuya plans to issue certificates to same-sex couples. They would recognize partners as equivalent to those married under the law. If this draft statute passes, the local government would be the first to issue such documentation in the country. We will issue certificates of partnership so that our community can embrace sexual minorities, said Ward Chief Toshitaki Kurawara. It's reported the majority of people in Japan are against recognition of same-sex unions, and only heterosexual marriages are recognized under the law. With the proposed certificate, it might make it easier for someone to be able to visit their partner at a hospital where only family members are allowed to visit. The ward will also request local businesses and residents to treat those with the certificate the same way they would a married couple. As the most populous country on Earth, China also puts enormous strain on its healthcare system. One critical component does appear to be in short supply, and just what is that component? Blood. Hospital blood supplies appear to be tight, forcing desperate patients to turn to agents known as bloodheads. They sell certificates giving patients access to state blood banks, creating a black market at the heart of the healthcare system. To us patients, buying blood solves our problems, said an individual surnamed Hong, a retired Shanghai civil servant who suffers from myelodysplastic syndrome. Hong continued, quote, "If there were no bloodheads, what would I do?" End quote. Chinese law encourages patients to present a certificate showing that they, their friends, or relatives have donated blood when they need to tap into the national supply. Some hospitals choose not to provide blood without presentation of these certificates. Periodic crackdowns on bloodheads don't appear to be effective. Don't worry about the police. We're outside most of the hospitals, and we know all the police officers, said one such bloodhead. By some estimates, blood reserves in China in some areas are only a third of what is actually considered safe by most healthcare standards. According to the China Daily, Chinese and Indonesian governments exchanged information on 9 terror suspects, believed to be from the Xinjiang region, who escaped to Indonesia after plotting an attack in China last year. Indonesian police arrested 4 of the 9, 3 others fled into the jungle, and 2 were believed to have made it to Malaysia. Those captured are likely to be extradited to China. The group is believed to be part of those who launched the terrorist attack in March of last year at a train station in Kunming, where 33 people were killed and 133 were wounded. In a story that broke last week, which I actually find quite disturbing, police in Fukui claim to have arrested a 17-year-old girl. They say she illegally disposed of the corpse of her newborn baby girl. According to police, the girl gave birth in a toilet at her home around dawn on February 4th. She is then accused of killing the infant and then dumping the body on the banks of the Umawatari River. The body was found by children commuting to school. They saw something that looked like a doll on the riverbank. And finally, it's wintertime, it's cold, and I have to say I love my noodles, especially during this time of year. The hot, steamy broth really helps fight off the cold, keeps me warm and toasty inside. In fact, some of the best noodles on the planet can actually be found in Japan's ramen shops. In a partnership with Lotte Corporation, one restaurant in Shinjuku is using the conglomerate's Ghana chocolate as part of their noodle dishes. Named Suke Ghana, after the chocolate and the method of serving the broth and noodles separately, according to one food reviewer, the noodles were surprisingly delectable. The noodles come with a fairly standard assortment of fresh vegetables, while the broth itself is infused with an entire tablet of chocolate. Next time I'm in Tokyo, I think I need to try this. As we wind down this very first Asian News Weekly of 2015, I'd like to thank you for joining me, but I'd also like to especially recognize the podcast patrons. These are individuals who have contributed financially to the podcast through its Patreon page as a way of helping me keep it going. So thank you very much, Victor, Hiko, Robert, Daniel, Brandon, Eric, Tim, Christopher, and R. Wiseman. I very much truly appreciate your monthly subscriptions, and I'm honored that you've chosen to contribute. As my way of saying thanks, every Sunday evening I do upload an exclusive podcast just for them, and you can learn more about supporting the podcast through its Patreon page. Just visit patreon.com/AsiaNewsWeekly. There's, of course, a link on our website. But before I go, I do want to share a few of your comments. Wandering Jim said, "Good to have you back, Steve." And I'd like to say thank you very much. He wasn't the only person to let me know that they're really appreciative of having the podcast back. I love doing them. And I'm glad that you are looking forward to hearing what is coming your way via the podcast. Moss Spider wrote, "Sentencing an innocent man to death. How can there be any excuse? It appears the prosecution and police of that region are offering blame as being structural and cultural pressures in their work environment and excusing their own. It's a failure of their moral and ethical practice to get to the truth in the first place." Eric E. said, "I'm amazed at the nature of public execution plots in Australia. I'm not very familiar with so-called Islamic extremist methods, but I don't think I've heard of this type of plan anywhere but there." The Dave York said, "I really doubt the girl will serve a year." Speaking of Hyuna Cho, she'll be bailed out after a few weeks or a month or two. Thank you so much for leaving the comments. I truly do value them, and I hope you'll take a moment to share your thoughts about the stories in this week's podcast, whether it be in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. Don't forget you can keep up with all the news in the region by following Asian News Weekly on Facebook and Twitter. You can also send an email to the show with your comments, your questions, and even your feedback. Just drop a line to podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. Subscribe to this podcast and others at asiannewsweekly.net or in your favorite podcast application like iTunes or Stitcher. Subscribing is free, and when you do, the next episode is delivered automatically to you. If you enjoyed this week's podcast, please share it with your friends. I'll be back on Monday morning with the Asia Brief, so until then, thank you so much for listening. For Asia News Weekly, I'm Steve Miller.